Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are glad you are here with us, and just by showing up today, you're already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I am pleased to feature two certified rock star music executives, each with a global reach and huge influence. Both have been on my target list for quite some time, and I am thrilled to have finally landed them for our audience. I promise you will leave today thinking, wow, who knew? And you'll also leave a lot smarter and more inspired than you arrived. Before we get started, please let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Most of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and please make some new ones. And ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those as possible along the way. And please make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the speakers. I want to thank our program sponsors for without their support, we could not keep this series free. Special thank you to First Horizon Bank, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, MedJet, Tennessee Brew Works, and Project Music. So let's get down to business. In today's host seat, we welcome Emmanuel Legrand. Emmanuel is a Washington, D.C. based freelance journalist and media consultant specializing in the entertainment business and cultural trends. He's currently the founder and editor of Creative Industries News, a platform which is a website and a newsletter, which covers the intersection of creative content, copyright, and licensing in the digital ecosystem. Prior to that, he was U.S. editor for British music trade publication Music Week. Previously, he was the editor of Impact, a magazine for the music publishing community. He was the global editor of the U.S. trade publication Billboard and the editor-in-chief of Billboard's sister publication called Music and Media. Emmanuel recently penned the report called Study on the Place and the Role of Authors and Composers in the European Music Streaming Market on behalf of GISAC, the European Groupment of Societies of Authors and Composers. Emmanuel, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And joining Emmanuel as today's featured guest is Mary Megan Peer. As Chief Executive Officer of Peer Music, Mary Megan Peer directs the largest privately owned company of its kind, operating in 38 offices from 31 countries, with well over 1 million titles owned or administered and over 200 employees worldwide. She's the third generation music publishing executive with a Wall Street background. Mary Megan is setting the standard for international publishing administration, and other global music publishers have flocked to Peer Music for sub-publishing, including Hypnosis, Big Machine, Concord, Sugar Music, and BMG. Mary Megan led the acquisition of the largest independent K-pop publisher in Korea in 2016, adding Korea as the 30th country to which the company's global network, along with 40,000 Korean copyrights and works by K-pop groups, including BTS, EXO, and Monsta X. She previously led the opening of Peer Music's first office in mainland China, becoming the first global independent in mainland China. She previously established a successful joint venture partnership in China, which made Peer Music the first Western independent publishing company to directly sign Chinese writers. Mary Megan holds a BA with honors from Stanford University and an MBA from Columbia Business School. She's been named to Billboard's Power 100, Women in Music, and International Power Players lists, and featured in Music Business Worldwide's Inspiring Women. It is an honor to welcome these two global rock stars to our platform. Take it away, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Tom. Do you feel like a rock star, Mary Megan?
Thank you for that very generous introduction, Tom, and also for having me here today and for pairing me with Emmanuel. I really appreciate that.
So, full disclosure, where are you located at the moment?
So I live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
And full disclosure, I saw you last week on my way to Eurosonic. We had lunch next to the train station, and I saw that you had become fully Dutch because you came with a bicycle. You had all the attire that was required, to be on your bike. So, is that what you call home these days, Amsterdam?
It is, yes. A couple years ago during the pandemic, we at Peer were working on an acquisition in the neighboring right space. This was a new area for Peer Music outside of publishing, and we acquired 3 companies during the pandemic in that space, one of which was based in Amsterdam, one in Biarritz in France, and the third in Montreal in Canada. And I thought it was going to be very hard for me to learn about the neighboring rights business sitting on a Zoom from New York, which was where I was living at the time. So I took the opportunity to move over here with my family. It's really taught me a lot about the neighboring rights business and the opportunities associated with it. But Amsterdam's also just a wonderful city to live in.
I agree. I really like the city. And funny enough, Tom was mentioning Music and Media, the magazine I had the honor of editing. Music and Media started in the Netherlands. And there's a reason for that, is that the Netherlands is one of the most open country when it comes to music in Europe. And so it was interesting to see that, they decided to create a pan-European magazine out of Amsterdam. I don't think any other country would have done that. And because you're Dutch, you're in a small country, but you have a passion for music, and that's how they created the magazine. So I had a lot of back and forth from Paris to Amsterdam in the old days, and then I moved to London to edit the magazine. You didn't grow up in New York, did you? Or
I did not grow up in New York. No, I was born and grew up in Los Angeles. But I moved to New York after college and have been there on and off ever since then. So
okay,
spent some time away as well.
so you're more like an East Coast person than a West Coast?
I guess. I love California and I'm there. Luckily, I'm there quite frequently. Certainly at this time of year, I'd probably prefer to be in California than in New York. But I have spent most of my professional life in New York and enjoy it there a lot as well.
Can I ask you a question? When you were 5, 7, 12 years old, what did you want to do in life? What was your dream job?
That's a good question. I'm sure it changed somewhat between when I was 5 and 12. I think I didn't necessarily see the music business per se as in my future. But I knew based off of seeing my parents and particularly seeing what my father was doing, that I wanted to work with people from a lot of different backgrounds. I thought that was fascinating, getting to meet people from different countries and hear about different challenges in those areas. So I think that was always something that I wanted to do. I think it was probably a little later in life that I realized how wonderful it is to work with creators, because it's not something that's my skill set, but the amount of passion that they bring to their work is so wonderful. And it's amazing to be exposed to that on a day-to-day basis. My prior career was in banking, and there's a lot less passion in that area.
I can see that. Was music a big part of your upbringing? Was there music all the time, or was it something that your father was keeping at work and not at home?
No, I think there was definitely a lot of music around. I wouldn't say it was overwhelming the business side of it, but he was always playing things to find out if we liked it, or talking about different concerts that he'd been to or was going to. So it was a fairly constant presence.
Mm-hmm. And did you learn to play an instrument?
I play very good high school piano. Not my forte, but I did.
Well, I remember going to your offices in Burbank, in California, and there's almost like a mini museum at in the entrance with there's a piano, there's a few pictures of your grandfather, there's some sheet music from the 40s and so on. I guess that has also must have informed a little bit your view of the world, since that was, you know, what your dad was doing on an everyday basis.
Yeah, again, something I probably did not appreciate as a very young child, but certainly later in life when I realized what the company had been founded on and how long it had been around as an independent entity, that really made an impression on me. We are getting close to our 100th year in the business. And certainly having that kind of legacy and that kind of body of works that we've been collecting for that long, it's really an honor to work with that. But yes, it is an amazing part of the company.
Yeah, so it's I don't know. Have you ever met your grandfather, or was he dead before you were born?
No, my grandfather actually passed away when my father was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not have the honor of doing that. I did know my grandmother somewhat, though she passed away when I was 10 years old. So I also didn't really know her particularly well as an adult. But I've been lucky enough to be able to learn a lot about both of them. There was a biography published of my grandfather a couple of years ago, which certainly taught me some things, and obviously I have stories from my father as well.
Do you you know, he was he kind of disrupted and revolutionized the music publishing world in some ways, don't you think? By, for example, taking splits as an arranger, or by, you know, understanding that, you know, Latin music was going to be big, things like that, and turning, you know, the company. I heard he was very good with contracts too. So that's probably a lot to be that you probably got inspired by, you know, if you from that perspective, from a family perspective, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think his legacy is really incredible. Just briefly, he was, before he started the publishing company, he was an A&R man at OK Records, which then later became RCA Victor, the name we would know it by now. And they realized that they were selling a lot of gramophones. You can see one right behind me, in the cities, but not so many outside of the cities. The type of music that they were selling records for was not being sold in countryside, surrounding areas, etc. They were selling what was really very city music at the time. And they also were working on a mobile recording device. Before then, if you wanted to record, you had to go into a studio. Obviously, those were mainly located in cities as well. But they had developed something that could be taken on the road, taken on trains. You know, portable in those days isn't what we'd consider it today, where you've got a tiny little box. But still, it was groundbreaking technology. And they asked my father in his A&R capacity to go out and record. And this is what led to the Bristol sessions, which are considered the big bang in country music. He also did recording in Chicago, Miami Smith. He really went out and started making records for the people who were not necessarily in New York. And he was very successful in doing that. He also went into Latin America, into Mexico and Cuba, as you mentioned. And while he was doing all this, he realized that the recordings were valuable, but the songs themselves were valuable and likely would have a life outside of these recordings. And with OK Records' permission, he founded a publishing company and signed the publishing as he was doing many of these early recordings. Unfortunately, not all of them, or else we'd have an even better catalog.
Well, you have quite an amazing catalog, and we'll get back to that. Just then, your father, Ralph Peer, that I guess everyone in the industry knows because he's been around for a while, is, you know, and is very well respected. He took the business from, I think it was your grandmother who took over from your grandfather for a while, and then, you know, your father took over. I think that's when the company became much more international, right? You know,
actually, my grandfather really started that legacy. He opened a company in Argentina in the 1930s. Many of our European companies also opened during that decade. And after he passed, my grandmother ran the company for 20 years, ran an international company, which was not something a lot of women were doing in the 1960s and 70s. And so she continued its genesis through that time. And then when my father became the head, he led the expansion into Asia. And also, I think, bolstered some of our South American operations. But we had been international in terms of being well established in Europe for quite a long time. And honestly, that's one of the things that really sustains us today, is that we do have 31 offices around the world, almost all of which have established local repertoire. So it's important, I think, at the societies to have real local repertoire, and also for writers to see that you're really invested in a country and not just kind of there as a outside sub-publisher.
We'll talk about your father for just a few more minutes, but what is of interest to me is, what did you learn from your father? What's the key? What are the key ingredients that he, aside from the DNA, that you got from your father, professionally, and probably also as a person?
I think my father is very good at reading people and taking that perspective into conversations with them, and how he negotiates with them, how he works with them. He very much appreciates, as I said before, people coming from different cultures and different perspectives, and he really thrives on being able to meld those into a single vision if he's working within the industry, or to really discover what makes a creator thrive and how we as a company can help them with that.
And I remember there was a movie in the 70s with Jean-Paul Belmondo called The Hair. And he's a businessman, he owns factories and all that. And one day he takes his son around and drives around the factories. And there's that fantastic line. It's like, "One day, my son, all these will be yours." Was there a moment with your father when he told you, one day, all these, i.e. the Peer Empire, will be yours?
No, certainly not. I think I was lucky in that, although my father never said I couldn't be part of the business, he certainly never pushed me towards it. He'd been working at the company since a very young age and never really had a professional position outside of the company. And I think that gave him the perspective that it was important to work at a company where your family's name isn't on the door. And I did that for 10 years. So I had some real experience, not only outside of pure music, but in a completely different industry. And I think that meant, particularly when I joined, that I brought some different skill sets to the table, also some different perspectives on how things can work. So I think that ended up being very useful for me. But no, there was never kind of a wow, look at all this moment.
I suspect you must have had some interesting discussions with people in the banking industry or whatever, trying to explain to them what music publishing is.
Well, it's funny because I actually, the part of banking that I specialized in was media and entertainment investment banking. So I've dealt with a lot of companies where IP was a key element of what they were doing. And whenever a company came in that had any element of music publishing, people were like, "Mary Megan's got to do that. No one else understands music publishing."
And today, do you understand music publishing?
I hope so. But it is changing so quickly. There's always more to learn.
Okay, so let's start with the beginning. How do you see the business of music publishing today compared to the way your father or your grandfather was dealing with it? Is there a fundamental shift?
I mean, I think part of the reason the company has been successful for so long is that there hasn't been a fundamental shift in in what publishing is. It's about finding great creators, giving their music the opportunity to be heard, and then properly collecting the remuneration for that so that they can make it a career. Clearly, there's been seismic shifts, but the fundamentals haven't actually changed that much. I think, obviously, we've just been through, and to some extent still are in, a period of a lot of capital being put into the industry, of publishers having access to a lot of money themselves. And that's led to some very high valuations on the acquisition front. I think it's also led to a lot of writers having very high expectations for the sales or the partial sales of their own catalog, which I think sometimes have not been met in the current market. The numbers that are bandied about are often for the biggest name catalogs. Obviously, we just saw the Justin Bieber one, but there's plenty of other folks in that ilk who really have been selling at these incredible multiples. But then there are many successful songwriters who just don't have catalogs that can sustain that type of multiple. So there's definitely been some disappointment on that front. So I mean, the recent money coming in and an appetite for acquisitions has been a change. I think in some ways it's great because it gives songwriters other options. 20, 30 years ago, songwriter would never have the opportunity to sell not only their publishing share, but the writer's share in some countries. And now that's becoming certainly normal in the Anglo-American territories and possible in some European territories. So the opportunities are increasing on that front.
Well, there's that guy called Tom Truitt who's asking, has the market for catalogs peaked already? Or do you think it's going to go, with the same kind of craziness and multiples?
I think it has peaked for now, but I'm adding in that for now because it seems like we're in a phase where every 3 or 4 years there's a new peak. And I think we might be a little quieter on that front. Clearly, there's just been so many deals done that there's less available right now. But I could see this coming back in 2 or 3 years and coming around again. I mean, I remember when the songs catalog was sold to Cobalt, everyone's like, well, we're never going to get higher than that. And then 3 years later, we did.
So how about, do you position yourself on deals like that? Or do you, well, when it reaches $200 million, you just say, well, that's for the other guys?
We're in an interesting position because as an independent company, we don't need to grow. We don't need acquisitions for that. We clearly, our goal is growth, but we're not expected to kind of have a regular quarterly increase in our size like some of our competitors are. We do participate in the acquisition market, but we don't have to go to what we'd consider a crazy multiple. A lot of the acquisitions we've done recently have been with catalogs of writers that we were already publishing. So catalogs that we essentially already knew an awful lot about, already had all the data in our systems, and writers who we knew personally. But we do some acquisitions that are just on the open market.
I remember a few years ago, it was at Meedem on the Croisette, and I bumped into your father. And there were all these, I think it was just a few weeks after you announced the acquisition of the David Foster catalog, or the agreement with David Foster. And there were all these rumors about the amount that, Peer Music had paid. So I asked you, Ralph Peer, so is it true that you paid $10 million for the catalog? And he looked at me and said, oh, I'm sure David Foster wish, we had paid that amount. And probably David Foster today would say, wow, I shouldn't have sold my catalog then, because, the multiples today are crazy. Do you think that's a reflection, a real reflection of the value of music?
I think there's a couple different forces at work there. Certainly the value of music in terms of its availability is growing. And there's more and more sources for remuneration, places for people to listen. Obviously, it's not a secret that we're, as a publisher, I'm not happy with a lot of the digital rates right now, but that income stream continues to grow in most countries. So that's hugely important. But I also feel like we were in a period with so much financing coming into the industry that the market just got a little bit toppy in terms of what you can really expect to make from these catalogs, particularly on the large catalog side. I think it's very hard to value to suggest that these catalogs were being under monetized in terms of not being used in commercials or films or not being available on streaming services. That was the case in a few catalog sales, but generally these were catalogs that were out there. So the buyer's ability to really make more on an annual basis on these catalogs was somewhat limited.
You mentioned, or was it Tom, that you have about 1 million copyrights? Is it wholly owned, or is it that it also includes all the admin that you do for other people?
Well, looking at admin, I think it's closer to about 3 million.
Wow.
We do administer a lot of fairly large catalogs.
Mm-hmm. And I remember I wrote a piece a long time ago when BMG, the second incarnation of BMG, announced that they had passed 1 million copyright mark, and the headline was 1 million copyright, what is it good for? So I'm asking you, 1 million copyright, what is it good for? Does it make a difference? Is it scale for scale, or how can you know all the 1 million songs that you have in your catalog?
Yeah, obviously you can't know 1 million songs, but you're going to have a better chance of it than knowing 10 million at a major, perhaps, if you're in the sync department. I would say that maybe 10 years ago, scale didn't matter as much, but there are two reasons today why it does matter more. The first is on the digital side, there are a fair number, particularly of kind of early digital deals that are done based off of market share rather than on a song by song basis. So in that case, having a larger catalog means more market share, which means you can pay your writers better from some of those initial allocations. Obviously, we would prefer that digital services pay us on a song by song basis, but there is some market share calculations that have gone on there and probably will continue to as these services become better with their data and being able to report on a kind of more full song by song basis. And so the other place that I think scale is really important these days is technology. The amount of data that we get on an annual basis is growing exponentially. It can be 100% a year more lines that we get. And to have the technology to process all of that accurately, quickly, you really need to invest in the technology. And if you have a small catalog, that's very, very hard to do. We're probably one of the few independents that has built our own proprietary copyright and royalty system. And it's not cheap, but we think it is absolutely the only way we could do what we have to do accurately and in a timely manner for our writers. And so I think when you have scale, you have the appropriate money to invest in that type of system.
Mm-hmm. I think it's Susan Schwartz who was asking of your copyrights, what percentage of are your prime income earners? Do you know the share?
Not off the top of my head. It's certainly more concentrated than 80-20 in that million, but I couldn't give you an exact share.
And you mentioned that you have all these offices and you sign a lot of local songwriters, composers, and so on. I guess the primary reason is that you want market share in those local markets. But how much of these works actually travel and translate into more business elsewhere than in the native countries of the composers or the songwriters?
Yeah, it varies a lot depending on what country we're talking about in terms of how much the music travels. Tom mentioned that we purchased a independent Korean publisher in Seoul in 2016. And that was right as K-pop was really taking off as a global phenomenon. When we made that purchase, I wasn't sure that all those writers were all of a sudden going to have international hits and number ones in Europe, but that has really happened since then. We are fairly, we have a pretty big network in Spanish-speaking countries all throughout Latin America, Spain, and then the US is also a huge Latin market. And those writers are obviously beginning to have a lot more success on an international basis, with Latin artists topping the charts in non-Latin territories. Or actually this week in Nashville, we just wrapped up a song camp that we put together top writers from our urban department, our Latin department, and Nashville country writers all together we had different working rooms, kind of to see what's going to come out and where the next opportunities in that space are. So we had Pooh Bear writing with Ashley Gorley, writing with Jorge Luis Chacin, who's a big salsa writer, and just all sorts of combinations like that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the demos that come out of that and seeing what type of artist actually records those songs.
Amina Tranbari is asking if you could speak more about the Asian market and what you do over there, and how do you see the evolution of the market in Asia?
I think Asia is not a market you can talk about as a single region, because the dynamics in the different countries are just very, very different. I mentioned Korea. That has become a huge global market. Japan has actually got a lot of similarities to the Korean market in terms of how the society works, how a lot of the songwriters work, but it hasn't become the same international success story. China is clearly a very exciting market for both local writers in China and for us on an international basis. Our income there has been growing huge amounts, partially due to the fact that having folks on the ground means that we actually can do synchronizations there, which 10 years ago was very, very rare. But also the digital opportunities are huge. Having folks on the ground there means that we can have individual agreements with all of the top DSPs. As I'm sure Emmanuel and probably many other people on this call know, the Chinese government actually cracked down on DSPs kind of licensing amongst themselves. So now publishers like us have to have individual agreements with all of the big ones. And that's been a lot of growth for us. Hong Kong and Taiwan have always had songwriter communities. And I think that those have been continuing. Probably the growth there is smaller than we're seeing in Korea or China, but certainly opportunities are increasing there as well.
And there's that small market called India. Are you active in India?
We are not. We have a sub-publishing arrangement there, so we do collect for our international writers there, but we don't have a local presence. It's a market that I do spend a lot of time looking at, and I would love to figure out the right way for us to have a presence there. It's such a, in and of itself, there's a very diverse music cultures in India. Obviously, the Bollywood music is hugely important, but then there's a big singer-songwriter section of it as well. So I would love for us to be in that market in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, and do some Bollywood movies and stuff like that. That could be fun. Let's talk about the US market. And there has been fundamental changes in the American market, not least because of the Music Modernization Act and the creation of the MLC. How do you, what do you make of what has happened since, the launch of the MLC? And are you happy with the way it functions and the money that gets back to you, because that's fundamentally what it is about. Is it better than the previous system?
It is certainly better than the previous system. I think the system we had before was somewhat broken, and it wasn't up to the data demands of what we need today with the DSPs. I think Chris and his team have done an excellent job. They launched it essentially very quickly during COVID, got the technology up and running. So yes, I'm happy with how it's working. Could it be working better? Probably yes. But I think that it's taking it one step at a time. They now have the system in place. I'm very happy that the DSPs are funding this. It's not coming out of songwriters' pockets. So I think that the overview of it is in place for it to continue to grow. And I think generally a lot of people are very happy with the transparency aspect that it has added to the US market.
Mm-hmm. How active personally or involved are you in the US operations of the company?
I am reasonably involved. Kathy Spanberger has been the president of our US company as well as our Canadian and Australian company for many, many years now. And she does a great job running what's going on there, both creatively and administratively. But it is a huge market and important on a worldwide basis. So I get involved in new songwriter deals, I get involved in acquisitions. And we do a fair amount of our administration in the US, so I get involved in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the new business that you got into, which is the neighboring rights market, which for the people in the audience who don't know what it is, it's basically the performance rights attached to sound recordings. It's a huge market in Europe, which is more or less 50% of the global markets of neighboring rights. And you, as you mentioned earlier, you during COVID, you bought the same day, or you announced the same day that you were buying 3 companies, one in France, one in Holland, and one in Canada. What drove that decision to invest into the neighboring rights market?
It was an area that we had been looking at, kind of our senior management team had been thinking about for a while, because we realized that there were a lot of similarities with publishing, that it was a way we could further use our global publishing network. But it's also very different from publishing. It's an entirely separate network of societies. In some cases, it's a very different client base. So we realized that rather than kind of jumping in and greenfielding ourselves, we really wanted to do it with folks who are experts in the business. So in 2020, we had the opportunity to purchase these 3 different companies. Between them, they had 5 founders, some of whom had been in the neighboring rights business for over 30 years, which is almost as long as you can have been in the neighboring rights business, given the legislative changes that made the neighboring rights business. Some of these folks had senior positions at neighboring rights societies. So it seemed like the right opportunity for us to get involved. It was also, they had a fairly large client base, so we could immediately take advantage of that and gain their know-how, their connections, and we could offer them a global reach. I think we came to it with them fairly similar in terms of how our attitude towards clients, our boutique level of client service, using technology to optimize what we were doing for clients. So it was a good fit for us in terms of a way to get into the neighboring rights business. More generally, why we were looking at neighboring rights is because not only the similarities with publishing, but because we believed it was an area that's going to experience probably stronger growth than the publishing markets over the next few years. There's a lot of changes and a lot of legislation on the neighboring rights side, which should bring more remuneration in. And there's a number of societies, CMOs, particularly in more developing countries, that are just being set up in neighboring rights. And many of these countries we already have our publishing operations in. So our plan, and in some cases this has already happened, we're able to collect in these territories that the companies we acquired previously hadn't been able to.
Well, probably also the upside is that you are also building a database of ISRCs that will be nice to have alongside your ISWCs in terms of data.
Absolutely. And we collect those on the publishing side as often as we can as well.
Mm-hmm. What part of the business does neighboring rights represent at the moment?
Neighboring rights income is probably about 20% of our top line.
And I think a couple of years ago, you said it was about 14-15%. So that has already grown
It
quite
has in the past
substantially.
couple of years, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which goes back to your point that there's going to be big growth in that area. I think Heather mentioned in the chat box that you collect for about 300 record labels and about 2,500 performers. You're almost like a mini collective management organization by yourself, right? It sounds
We are
like
fairly large as an agency, yes.
Yeah. So that must make some pretty decent checks at the end of the month or every month. The neighboring rights market is interesting because in a lot of countries it is about what radio stations would pay and do pay to the owners of sound recordings, except for one country, the US.
A big one.
The biggest country, the biggest market hasn't got neighboring rights. They have, Sound Exchange collects about over $800 million, but from non-interactive digital platforms. But radio stations pay zero, zilch, nada. Is that fair?
I don't think it's fair, but I don't think that is going to change given the legislative environment in both the US and in other countries today. It is absolutely amazing to me that Sound Exchange collects from, essentially just from Sirius XM and Pandora. They have a couple small non-interactive streaming services and radio aspects, but essentially from couple of sources, they collect more money than any other neighboring rights collection society in the world. And so although it is a very different market, and certainly the fact that radio does not carry a neighboring right in the US makes it smaller than it could be, it is still a substantial market for these type of rights.
How do you see music publishing evolving in the next 5-10 years? Aside from the catalogs and the selling and the buying of catalogs, but the business itself, how do you see that, when you have your discussions with your team, your head of Europe and UK last week said in an interview with Music Week, Nigel Ellerton, that there was an imbalance between the money that goes to publishing versus the money that goes to recording when it comes to streaming. Do you think that's going to be the major change that needs to take place in the next few years for music publishing?
Certainly, I would welcome that, but I'm not sure that's something that's going to happen in the immediate future. I think we're more likely to be able to kind of grow the pie for the publishers and record labels together by changing other aspects of it than actually changing the division between recording and publishing. I'm sure you saw, it was actually probably in your newsletter today, that Amazon is increasing their rates for their monthly subscribers and streaming. That grows the pie for all of us. If Spotify did the same, it would be even more impactful. So I'm hoping to see that type of change in the immediate future.
Mm-hmm. Well, one can dream, but why not? I'm sure that Daniel Ek has a few issues to deal with, and that might be one of them. Someone is asking if you could speak about the Canadian market and your operations over there.
Sure. I think that question came in when we were talking about neighboring rights, but I'm not sure. But we have both publishing and neighboring rights companies in the Canadian market. On the publishing side, we represent a lot of great Canadian acts and singers, including the Tragically Hip, Corey Hart, just to name a few. On the neighboring rights side, we also represent a lot of great Canadian artists and record labels. I think, since I believe this question was on the neighboring rights side, it's a complicated situation in Canada. There is an umbrella society that does all the collections, and then goes to, I believe, 5 different societies who do the division payouts to individual performers, labels, agents, etc. And we're paying very close attention to it because it seems to be ripe for change, and probably not the most efficient way to set things up right now.
Well, you know, I'm currently staying in a country, France, that has 4 neighboring rights societies, 2 for performers and musicians and 2 for owners of sound recordings. That doesn't look like the most efficient setup in the world.
I would agree with that. I know there are historical reasons why all those different entities were set up. And I would imagine that if they could at least share collections together, share a single system, that would probably be more efficient and put more money in the hands of the rights owners.
Inshallah, as we say. It's Susan Schwartz again, who's asking, what are your thoughts about AI generated music from a legal standpoint, but also probably from a creative standpoint? Is that something that is going to be the death of songwriters and, you know, the start of a new era for the music industry?
I don't think it is the end of songwriting, but I do think there could be some changes that result from it. As part of our Song Camp this week, we actually had an expert on ChatGPT come to speak with our writers on new opportunities, how it may change how they work, what potential threats, because we think it's really important to keep our creators abreast of these things. And understand how it may change what's going on in the room. From what I've seen come out of ChatGPT, it's not going to be a completed song anytime soon, but certainly you could take some elements from it, just like for your homework, you could probably take some elements out of it. I think that the immediate disruption that's most likely is probably in the gaming space, where perhaps a composer could compose a theme song and then AI could be used to generate all the background music based off of that theme song, or something like that, where the song is not necessarily the focal point of the game, but is clearly very, very important for what goes on. I think that type of thing is already being done to some extent, and I think that could be done without sacrificing what the music's being used for. In terms of a legal perspective, I'm not a lawyer, and clearly there are big questions as to copyright ownership when things come out of a ChatGPT or some other AI technology, whether or not it's the creators of the technology, whether it's the person who made the query, asked the question, if it's a mix of those, if it also relies on prior art. Those are all really complicated copyright questions that I do not have the answer to.
I wanted to go back to very quickly to your management structure. So you're the CEO of the company, and your father is the chairman. Is that correct? How do you split the duties between the two of you?
My father is more involved at this point in industry issues, though he remains very involved, on a daily basis with Pure Music. Given that he is in California and I am in Europe, sometimes I spend a little bit more time with this half of the world, and he spends a little more time with the other half, just given time zones. But we don't have a strict kind of division of labor, so to speak.
Mhm. Is there a neutral, independent process in case of disagreement between you and your father? Has it happened?
So to date, we have not needed one. So I hope that continues.
Mhm. It's interesting, again, going back to Medium, one day I was doing a 1 hour session on what it means, what are music publishers and what is it that they do. I think that was the time Medium was trying to open up to aspiring songwriters and artists. And I saw coming into the room your father. And I said, Ralph, what are you doing here? You know, you probably know more about music publishing than I do. And his answer was very interesting because he said, I am interested in seeing the perspective that people have, people like you, i.e. me, have about music publishing. And since you are an outsider, you might see something in our company that, you know, I might have not seen. And I thought that really first reflected on his own curiosity, which is, you know, he's known for. You know, he was interested in, you know, in something new, different, or trying to. And the second thing he told me is like, I think I'm going to use, you know, some of your tips to explain to some of the people who join the company what it is that we do. So my question to you is, do you have a certain vision of, you know, how music publishing should work and how it should be structured, and what, you know, and if you have to apply those changes, you know, what would they be?
Well, I think ultimately music publishers are only here because of the songwriters, the composers, the producers that we represent. So any changes have to be in their best interest. And I think when I'm making tough decisions about which way to take the company in, I really think about those partners and what's optimal for them, what's optimal now, what's optimal in 5 years. And that's part of the reason why I think we as a company, but also the industry, has spent so much time on issues like creating the MLC, like new digital licensing initiatives in Europe. Because really to do the work, the business side of the song work, you have to be working together as an industry.
Mhm. Um, there's your company has been in, you know, a family-owned company for, as you said, almost 100 years, which is, you know, quite remarkable. But there's two questions. The first one, would you consider doing what Reservoir did, which is to get listed on NASDAQ or whichever stock market? Is that something you're contemplating or not?
It is not, and that may be a fault or due to my experience as an investment banker. I actually think a company the size of Reservoir, we're a little bigger than they are, but we're still not huge. The costs of being a public company probably overwhelm the benefits in terms of the auditing, the accounting, the regulatory compliance issues. Not that we don't, you know, account, have auditors, etc. But the level that you need to do that in on a regular basis as a public company is really more than I would personally want to be doing. I also don't think it would benefit our songwriters to any great extent.
But it would give you access to more money for growth, for acquisition, etc.
No, that's absolutely true. As I mentioned earlier, and certainly isn't a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone here, there's a lot of money available for publishers right now. You know, certainly we could go to the debt markets and also get a lot more money than we have. As if perhaps there was something out there that was huge that we thought we really wanted, I guess it would be an option, but I don't see that being the immediate path for our company.
How would you qualify, you know, do you call yourself an independent music publisher, an independent music company? What's your, you know?
Well, it's an interesting question. We certainly call ourselves independent,
Mhm.
but in addition to being a music publisher, we are now a neighboring rights agency. So that has become a little bit part of our moniker. We pride ourselves also on being a global company, having offices around the world and having close relationships with all those offices. So it's a part of the identity that's important to us as well.
Looks like everybody has a price. Justin Bieber's price is 200 million. What's Peer Music's price?
I have not done the math on that recently.
But would you consider selling if one day some, venture capital firm or, comes with a big check and say, well, we'll take over, we'll let you continue to manage the company, but here's the money.
But it's probably not a surprise that we have had folks come knocking
I can
during some of the
imagine.
overheated markets, and never have we thought it was the right decision for us or for the songs that we represent. I guess you never say never, but that isn't part of our planning right now.
So you have twins, right?
I do, yes.
They're 7 years old.
As of next week, we have a good memory.
So do you see them in 20, 30 years from now taking over from you?
I think, like my father, I would say that is entirely their choice. And I will be happy no matter what they plan to do. Right now, I'm just, worried about them learning Dutch and getting to school on time. So we have a few more years before that's going to be an immediate decision for them.
Well, if they're learning Dutch, I'm sure they can learn music publishing, because I'm sure music publishing is not as hard as learning Dutch. How's your Dutch, by the way?
My Dutch is not great. I'm trying, but it is unlike any language that I have learned before.
So where do you see the company in the next 5 to 10 years? Where if you have a blank page and say, okay, you draw something for Peer Music, what would it be?
Well, we already spoke about India. I think also the African continent is a place that we would like to really develop our business in the next 5 to 10 years. We do have a company in South Africa, and we have writers signed in several other territories there. But I think in terms of where global hits are coming from, where new ideas are taking root, I think that's a really important area for us to keep on top of. And boring, but I've got to say, we got to keep on top of the technology too, in order to deliver for our songwriters.
And it's probably going to be one of the last questions, because it's 58 to the hour. There aren't that many women chief executive of music companies, music publishing, record labels, etc. Why is that?
Before my time, I think it was probably more of a men's industry than it is. I would say there are more and more women who are CEOs of music companies, certainly societies these days. There's a number of females who are CEOs. And I think that's only going to continue to grow as the management ranks get to be more female. I don't think there's anything about music publishing that is not friendly to women. Actually, we have, I think, more female managing directors than male managing directors around our company these days. If not, it's pretty close.
Well, leading by example. Well, Tom, are we on time, or do we have time for more questions?
We sure are. We pretty much have exhausted all of them. Mary Megan, I've got one question on a personal level. Who's your favorite artist of all time? What's your desert island artist?
Oh, that's a good one. In terms of desert, like with the desert island, it can't be a single song, right? It can't be a one-hit wonder. I think the catalog of Queen is probably one of those ones that you could listen to forever and always hear something new in.
That's a catalog you guys might consider taking a run at.
I don't see that coming to market soon, but
talk about a trophy on your mantle.
Yes, no, Tom, I have to say thank you for setting this up and to Emmanuel as well. And for folks who are on this who don't know, Emmanuel's Creative Industries News is kind of become a must read for the industry. So I highly recommend subscribing to that. If you can keep up with all the stories that he does, I'd be very impressed. But it really does include a lot of what's going on a political level, with the DSPs, with the societies. So it's a good read.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say that you are my biggest customer in terms of the number of subscriptions that you've taken, and I really thank you for that. And that's, you know, really I appreciate that a lot. So you know, and for being an independent and supporting independent news platforms, I think that's I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I will echo what Mary Megan says about Emmanuel's newsletter. If you're a student trying to get into this business, or even an executive in this business, it's a must read. I look forward to getting it every week. So thank you, Emmanuel, and keep doing it. Mary
Thank you.
Megan, to you, I'm totally inspired by your story. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and kind of what's going on inside your very unique and very interesting business. And I hope you stay private. I do hope your children take it over and keep it going 20 more years from now, and just keep doing what you're doing, keep innovating and keep acquiring more catalogs that put more money in the pockets of these writers. So with that, I will say goodbye to the audience. Thank you for your participation. We'll see you next Thursday. Be nice to each other and stay safe.
Thank you. Goodbye.